The prairie was a sheet of pale gold that morning, the kind of light that feels too fragile to last. Frost clung to every blade of grass, and the air smelled of pine smoke and loneliness. Clara May Whitfield crossed the ridge with a tin pail in her hands, her breath rising like prayer smoke. Her cabin sat far from Red Hollow, too far for company, too close for comfort. Folks in town said she'd gone half wild after her folks died of fever. They called her the Whitfield ghost, though she still had flesh, still drew breath, and still tended to her father's land with quiet devotion. She didn't mind the names anymore. Loneliness had become her way of speaking to the earth. That morning, when she reached the creek, she heard it. A low, guttural snarl carried through the wind. Then another, closer. The pail slipped from her hand, water spilling over her boots. Her pulse quickened, and her eyes swept the tree line. Wolves. But mixed with the growls came another sound. A man's voice, rough and faint, calling for help. She moved toward it without thinking, rifle slung across her shoulder, heart pounding against her ribs. Through the birches she saw him, a man sprawled in the snow beside a fallen horse, blood staining his sleeve. 3 wolves circled, their breath misting in the cold. He held a revolver, but his hands shook too hard to aim. Clara lifted her father's old rifle and fired into the air. The crack echoed like thunder. The wolves scattered, vanishing into the brush, their shadows dissolving with the wind. When she reached the man, he was trembling, eyes glazed with fever. "Easy," she whispered. "You're safe now." He tried to sit up, failed, and grabbed her wrist. "Don't let the town see me," he rasped. "They'll send me back." She didn't ask who or where. She just nodded, her breath fogging in the cold. "You'll come with me, then. No one will bother us out here." By dusk, she had dragged him to her cabin, his weight heavy, but his spirit heavier. The storm rolled in behind them, snow sweeping across the valley. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and old quilts. She stitched his wound by the firelight, her hands steady even as the blood stained her apron. He watched her through half-closed eyes, disbelief softening the lines of his face. "Why'd you save me?" he whispered. She didn't look up. "Because no one saved me when I needed it." He slept after that, fevered but breathing. She sat by the fire, watching the snow climb higher against the windows, the storm swallowing the world whole. Days blurred together. She fed him broth when he woke, changed his bandages, and listened when he spoke in fragments about his past. His name was Eli Carter, a ranch hand turned drifter. He'd once worked for the McAllister spread, until a man he called a friend accused him of theft. He'd run before they could hang him, chased through the canyons by both men and wolves. Clara didn't judge. In her world, truth was a lonely thing. Most folks couldn't afford to tell it. She saw in him the same exile that lived inside her. When he was strong enough to stand, he helped her chop wood, repaired her fence, even fixed her broken lantern. Neither spoke much, yet something gentle began to grow between them. Not the wild kind of love that shouts and burns, but a quiet ache, something like trust. One evening, while she poured him stew, their hands brushed. He pulled back as if burned, mumbling an apology. She smiled faintly. "You're not the first soul to flinch from kindness." Outside, snow fell in slow silver flakes, each one catching the firelight before dying against the window. But peace never stayed long in Clara's world. Word reached Red Hollow that smoke had been seen rising from the Whitfield place. Mrs. Hensley, who ran the mercantile and the gossip, told anyone who'd listened that Clara was hiding a man. The story grew with each telling. Some said a bandit, others a murderer. Sheriff Amos Dunn rode out 2 days later to see for himself. He found Clara splitting wood by her porch. "Afternoon, Miss Whitfield," he said, eyes sharp beneath his hat brim. "Heard tell you've got company." She didn't pause her work. "Only ghosts, Sheriff." He narrowed his eyes, then looked past her toward the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney. A shadow moved inside. For a moment, silence. Then he spat, adjusted his hat, and turned his horse around. "Ghosts don't eat stew, Miss Whitfield. Be careful who you keep for company." When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Eli stepped out from behind the door, jaw tight. "You shouldn't lie for me." She shrugged, stacking another log. Wouldn't be the first lie this town's heard. He looked at her a long time, something unreadable in his eyes. You don't deserve what they say about you. She smiled without looking up. Maybe not, but I've learned to live quieter than their tongues. That night, the snow came again, thick and endless. The fire burned low. Clara dreamed of her father's voice, warning her that a woman alone was meant for sorrow. She woke to the creak of the door, the cold air biting her skin. Eli's bed was empty. On the table lay a folded note, his handwriting rough but careful. You saved me. I'll repay it one day. She stood in the doorway, wind whipping her hair, snow swirling around her bare feet. For a long while she watched the white horizon, wondering if mercy ever came back once it left. The prairie stretched on, vast and empty, holding her silence like a secret the world would never ask to hear. Spring came slow to Red Hollow, like a promise that didn't quite trust itself. Snowmelt trickled down from the hills, carrying the scent of pine and mud. The prairie turned green again, though the wind still carried whispers of winter and of Clara May Whitfield. She worked alone, as always. The townsfolk watched her from behind curtains and store windows, still convinced she was a strange one. They said she'd hidden a wounded man through the storm. They said she'd nursed him back to life and sent him off before the thaw. Some even said she'd conjured him, like a ghost from her loneliness. Clara didn't answer. She mended her fences, fed her horses, and spoke to no one but the wind. But one morning, while she was at the well, a cloud of dust rose on the horizon. Hooves thundered. A company of riders approached the town, cattlemen, scouts, and one man at their head wearing a clean shirt, a polished badge, and the sun behind him. When Eli Carter swung off his horse, time stilled. His hair was shorter, his shoulders straighter. His eyes, though, they were the same eyes that had looked up at her from the snow, wild and afraid and grateful. He tipped his hat. Miss Whitfield. Every whisper in town fell silent. Mrs. Hensley's jaw dropped, her loaf of bread nearly slipping from her hands. Sheriff Dunn looked from Eli to Clara, his expression unreadable. Clara nodded once and turned back toward her wagon, heart steady as if nothing inside her stirred. But everything did. For the next week, Eli stayed on, helping Sheriff Dunn investigate a string of cattle thefts. The two men rode out at dawn, dust rising behind them, and every evening the town gathered to speculate what business a lawman had with the Whitfield girl. Some said he was back for her. Others said he was ensuring justice. Clara said nothing. She'd learned long ago that silence was its own kind of armor. Until one dusky afternoon, while mending a fence near the edge of her property, she heard the old familiar growl. Her horse reared. She turned, heart racing. Two wolves stood among the mesquite, their ribs sharp beneath thin fur, hunger in their eyes. She reached for her rifle, but the trigger jammed with rust. A shot cracked through the air. One wolf fell. The other fled into the brush. Smoke drifted over her shoulder. When she turned, Eli was there, dismounting from his horse, breathless, his badge glinting faintly in the sun. "Guess I owed you one," he said with a crooked smile. She lowered her rifle and smiled back, quiet but sure. "Debt's paid." He shook his head slowly. "Not yet." That night, he stayed for supper. The cabin felt smaller than she remembered, the firelight softer. He told her how he'd cleared his name, how the real thief had confessed in Yuma, how the world looked different now that he wasn't running. She listened, her eyes on the fire. When he finished, silence filled the room like snow. Outside, the prairie breathed, owls calling, wind through dry grass. She poured him coffee, her hand steady despite her heart's tremor. "And now?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Now I go where I'm wanted." Before she could speak, the horses outside screamed. Then came the sound again, growls, snarls, snapping twigs. She grabbed her rifle. Eli was already at the door. The wolves had returned. A full pack this time, drawn by the scent of her cattle. Their eyes shimmered in the moonlight, dozens of them, circling. Eli loaded his gun. She stood beside him, breathing hard, her heart pounding like a drum. "Stay behind me," he said. "Not a chance," she replied. The first wolf lunged. Eli fired, then another. Clara took aim and shot true, her father's old rifle steady in her hands. Dust rose in clouds. Wolves yelped, horses screamed. One leapt from the side. Eli caught it midair, knife flashing. Clara swung the rifles, but striking another away from him. For a long moment, it was chaos, the kind that bends time and makes every heartbeat eternal. Then, suddenly, silence. The survivors vanished into the trees. Only the sound of their ragged breaths filled the night. Clara looked around, her fence half broken, moonlight falling on Eli's bloodied sleeve. "You all right?" she asked, her voice shaking. He nodded. "You?" She gave a small, breathless laugh. "Still standing to." He smiled faintly. "You always were." The wind moved through the tall grass, soft as a sigh. Eli reached for her hand, hesitated, then took it. His fingers were rough, warm. "Clara May," he said quietly, "I ain't much for speeches, but I'd ride through 1,000 more nights like this if it meant finding you at the end." She didn't answer, not in words. She just slipped off her glove and held his hand tighter. The fire in the cabin flickered behind them, painting their shadows across the earth, two silhouettes stitched together by courage, silence, and grace. At dawn, they rode into Red Hollow side by side. The town fell silent again. Only this time, no one whispered. Sheriff Dunn tipped his hat as they passed. Mrs. Hensley just stood on her porch, speechless for the first time in her life. The church bell rang, not for gossip but for vows. They married beneath the cottonwoods, with the prairie wind playing in her hair and sunlight spilling like honey across the grass. Clara wore her mother's faded dress. Eli wore the same boots he'd nearly died in. Their hands met, and the whole valley seemed to exhale, like the land itself had been waiting for them to find their way home. And if you ever find yourself alone on the wide prairie, think of her, the girl who saved a stranger not for love, but for mercy, and found love only when mercy turned into courage. Because the wolves we face don't always wear fur. Some come as fear, some as loneliness, some as the voices that tell us we're not enough. But kindness, quiet, stubborn kindness, can still turn a life around. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to show mercy first, love will ride back for you when the snow melts.